All right, I'm really nervous. I've introduced the Kerrang Awards and been in a band that is played in front of, well, 10 people. But I don't think I've ever been more nervous than I am about this event.
Yay!
I really appreciate everyone for coming along. And
You'll be fine, James.
thank you, Joe.
Thank
We're not here for reassurance. Little OCD joke there, little inside baseball. Yeah, so the reason I wanted to hold this event was because the website that I run, or one of them anyway, the OCD Chronicles, is a year old, and I wanted to get together some of the people who had done Q&As on the site just to mark that. Really, it feels a bit weird to celebrate, but just to kind of mark it with an event. The reason I kind of started that website was because I think that when you are diagnosed with OCD, or you finally have a name for this chaos which has been reigning in your mind, I think there's a degree of euphoria in having something to call it, and not feeling like you are completely broken or unlike anyone else. And there's a real excitement, I think, that comes from connecting with people who have the same or similar experiences to you. But what I really wanted to do with this site is I really am interested in, as someone who, oh, hello Grace. What I really wanted to do with this site was that I wanted to create a place where I could gather together some inspiring stories about OCD. In the, there'll be people in the who are attending tonight who I don't have to articulate just how difficult and debilitating the disorder can be. But to be honest, anyone who is a loved one of someone who's attending tonight, so they'd like to know more, I don't think that they would need much persuading to understand that either. But I've always been kind of interested as a journalist and as someone who only really wants to make things and wants to have a rich and fulfilling life. I've always been really interested in trying to create something that can tell people that you shouldn't give up on life, and there is hope, and there are resources, and there is information out there which can help you lead a good life. So that's one of the reasons why I've invited you guys. Anyway, so I guess I'll, without further ado, I'll introduce the people who we've got in this conversation tonight. The way that this is going to work is we're going to basically have a conversation that's kind of steered by me. And then with about 30 minutes to go, we'll have a bit of a Q&A if anyone has anything that they would like to ask anyone who's here tonight. I think the way that we should do that is if anyone has a question as we go through this, then put it in the chat and I will see the questions that way. There's a friend of mine called Danielle who is coming any moment now to clarify in the chat any kind of insider terms that anyone uses. So if there's anything that you don't understand, if we use an acronym for ERP or CBT or whatever, then please just put that in the chat if you'd like to know more about what that is, and Danielle can give you some info. Right, let's start with Joe Edge. Where else could we start? Joe, tell the people who you are and what you do.
Hello, everyone. My name's Joe Edge. I'm a medieval historian, sometime musician, one-time musician, and I co-founded Mad COVID almost a year ago, which is a sort of a shared space for survivor and user service user projects, and we have like a hardship fund and diaries and all this kind of thing. And we are over at www.madcovid.com. I'm a union rep. I really like dogs. So yeah, that's me. And I have obsessive compulsive disorder. So
Max.
Yeah, I'm Max Hawker. I'm not a medieval historian. I am in fact an author, and I work frontline in children's social care. My first children's book, which features a character with OCD, is Rory Hobble and the Voyage to Hallygoggin. That's out on July the 8th. And I've had obsessive compulsive disorder since I was a child. So we're actually coming up to a bit of an anniversary, almost 20 years since I received the diagnosis.
David?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm David Adam. Not that it's a competition, but I've had OCD for 30 years this summer, and I hadn't told anybody about it until I wrote a book. I wrote a book about 4 or 5 years ago called "The Man Who Couldn't Stop," and since then I haven't really stopped talking about it, about OCD. I work as a freelance journalist. And I do a fair amount of, I basically say yes to everybody who asks me to do anything when it's OCD related, which is partly why I'm here.
And what a book it is. Sorcha.
Hi, I'm Sorcha. I'm an actor and a writer. I've had OCD since I was really tiny, like 3, 4, 5, and I was diagnosed when I was 20, and up till then I didn't have any clue what it was. So it was like a light bulb moment. And I wrote a play a couple of years ago called Lady Bones, which is about kind of based on my experience of having OCD. And I was touring that until coronavirus put a stop to things.
Do you think you can resume in light of what's been announced today?
Oh, I don't know about times, but I think at some point I'll continue the tour, but might be a while yet.
Yeah, no, good. I was. It was high on my list of things I wanted to do before everything hit as well. So let's talk a little bit about our experiences. So Joe, would you mind kicking us off and telling us what you're comfortable with talking about how you came to know you had OCD, or kind of those early days, really?
Sure. So I've always had OCD. I think that's kind of obvious, but I've only had a diagnosis for about 5 years now. In fact, just over 5 years. And a lot of stuff started to make sense when I got that diagnosis. The way that my OCD tends to flare up is with stress and severe depression, which is another pain in my ass. And there are other diagnoses that I definitely identify with very strongly, such as autism and ADD. So there's a kind of a whole bunch of stuff going on. But I was diagnosed with OCD at 35 when I had a severe mental breakdown that lasted over a year. And yeah, it's a very much a shapeshifter with me. So I've had various different worries over or different obsessions. I can speak a bit about that now if you want, or
yeah, go for it. That's fine. Wherever you can.
Yeah. So when I was 9 years old, I had a pregnancy scare. And obviously, this is, I think the people with OCD or who know someone with OCD here will kind of go, right, that makes sense. But for people who don't know what I'm talking about, they're probably going, what the hell? But yeah, I was 9 years old and I was a voracious reader as a child. So I knew the facts of life when I was quite young. And some awful things happened when I was 9. My mum was hospitalised and I got moved up here in school and all this. And I was obviously a very stressful time. And I was convinced that I'd had sex with this boy and that I was pregnant somehow. And I can remember actually reassurance seeking from my parents, who must have just thought, like, what the hell is wrong with her? Like, but it was really, really distressing, really distressing. And then from my mid-teens up until I was in my mid-30s, I basically suffered this terrible stage fright, and I was performing a lot in bands, and toilet phobia. So it's not particularly glamorous, but I thought I was going to soil or wet myself, basically. And the worry about that would make me sort of need the loo, and it would become this horrible vicious cycle. So that kind of played into kind of obsessive compulsive, and it just felt like it was going to ruin everything. And I'm still really, really funny about toilets now, not in a contamination way, just in a it's quite literally a pain in my ass, but I'm a lot better with it now because I'm on the right dose of meds. And in my mid-30s, when I had my big breakdown, it all revolved around quite distressing worries about child abuse and that kind of thing. And it's something that I have to keep an eye on every day. But I'm now on a really good dose of medication. Sertraline, it really works for me. And I was very lucky to live in the London Borough of Southwark, and I was referred to CADAT at the Maudsley, which is an OCD specialist. It's a national centre for OCD treatment, and I had amazing and life-changing therapy with a lady called Dr. Fiona Chalacombe. And I also had to work really hard to change my life and stop drinking alcohol and, you know, do things that I want to do and prioritize my own happiness, because that's a huge part of overcoming it, or of learning to live with OCD, is dealing with that collateral damage and those unhealthy ways of being. So, you know, I don't get to miss a night of sleep. I don't get to, you know, forget to, well, I wouldn't forget to eat anyway, because food is my life. But, you know, I don't get to kind of, I have to, it's really, really hard work maintenance, but it's so worth it, considering how poorly I was, you know. So, but yeah, I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So 4 years ago today, actually, I would have been in the Maudsley in wards. So it was extremely serious. And I nearly didn't make it. So
that is something worth celebrating, though, that you're here.
Yeah, you know, and so for me, it's like the little things. Everything's a win. You know, everything is a bonus. Everything's great, and I'm just really, I that's why I want to share things. It's because when I was on the ward, there were people there that had nobody and nothing, and very few prospects, you know, very few sort of reasons to get better. Whereas I had friends, a partner, work that I loved, reasons to get back to my life, and it was still so hard for me. So there's always this intersection with relative privilege, and I have to kind of, for me, what happened means that I have to kind of try and make things better. And that's just my way of dealing with it too. And also I'm completely self-obsessed and I like talking about myself, so it's fine. But yeah, I'm really glad to be here, and you know, COVID and stuff. There has been a lot of challenges, but yeah, but yes, that's
there's a bunch of things you just said there that I'm going to come back to in a bit. But Max, can you tell us a bit about your way in?
Yeah, just listening to Joe, I was just reflecting on how I think I first knew, and I think I was probably around 11, 12, and I remember having worries about whenever I went camping with Scouts, because I was part of Scouts. We used to do these hikes, and sometimes we go over the motorway bridges, and I was obsessed with this fear that I'd been chucking bricks and rocks onto the cars from this motorway bridge, and I was terrified, and I was scanning the internet. I was looking through newspapers to see if there had been any kind of terrible accident that I could connect to me being in the vicinity at the time. And from there, it moved in lots of different directions, as though my OCD was settling itself in and thinking, right, let's have a bit of a play around and see what makes him tick. Let's see what really gets to him. And so I had a range of different obsessions. Some of them were cleanliness based. Some of them were fears about being responsible for people dying because I was saying unpleasant things to them. But it settled on a fear of wanting to harm children, or to, again, child abuse basically, and all the kind of permutations around that. And that's what it kind of settled on. I grew up in an abusive home, and that's part of the reason why I work in social care now. But I think that probably contributed to it somewhat. And throughout my late teens and throughout my 20s as well, I was just absolutely terrified that I was responsible for harming children in a range of different ways. And it was absolutely awful, especially as a man, having these kinds of fears about yourself and then working in social care. It's an interesting mix. I think for me, getting that therapy when I did, and I was probably about 14, 15 when I started seeing my first therapist. Make it sound like a date. That was a key moment, and that was when I had CBT, and I got started on clomipramine as well. And since then, I think I've probably seen 5 or 6 different therapists over the years, and it's taken quite a long time to get to a stage where I'm relatively stable and I'm comfortable enough to start talking about it and hopefully encouraging others to do the same. But that, I suppose, is a loose overview of my experience of OCD. But it's interesting how it almost has an intelligence. It sort of dives into your mind and it picks out these things which you it knows almost that it's going to upset you. And if something works for a little while, then it will stick with it. And then once that loses a bit of its power, then something else will come along. And eventually it comes to find something which really, really gets to you. And for me, that was child abuse. That was the thing which really upset me, and the thing which I would never want myself to, be involved in, obviously, like any rational person. And that was the theme for me.
I guess what was the chief learning that came from your experience with therapy?
I think that it's all well and good to say you can try and go it a lot alone and hunker down, bottle things up, but it's not big or clever or strong or mature to do that. If you know that things aren't right and you are struggling, then you really do need to reach out for support. And we're going to have all kinds of conversations about how good the support is in the UK particularly. There's a lot that could be said about that, but at the end of the day, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure response prevention, very, very important tools in combating OCD are available on the NHS. And for me, the overriding message from being in therapy was that I was I was so thankful that I had managed to do it, because if I hadn't, I'm not completely sure I would be here today.
David, tell us a bit about your early experiences with OCD and a bit of treatment history, if that's okay.
Yeah, so my OCD came later than Joe, Max, it sounds like. I was about 19 years old. And I just started having these, what I now know are intrusive thoughts, so completely irrational thoughts about HIV, about how I could have caught HIV. And, I talk to people nowadays and that they don't get it. Well, why HIV? And it's because I grew up in the 80s and it was this sort of societal obsession in a way. It was this great threat, and the only weapon that governments had at the time to try and make people change their behavior was to scare the bejesus out of them. And so they put all these adverts on TV, and and so it was very common. I didn't know any of this now, but by the end of the 80s, something like a third of all OCD patients had incorporated HIV and AIDS into their obsessions. So mine has never diverged from that. It's always around HIV, and kind of weirdly, it's not around HIV that you encounter it today. It's the HIV of the 1980s, which was still effectively an untreatable disease. If I was to, I'm nearly 50 now. If I was to catch HIV tomorrow, it isn't HIV that would kill me. Chances are. So it's actually a completely different threat or a different worry to what I first experienced, but the OCD remains the same. So, or the content of the OCD remains the same. So I also live, I was very lucky. I live in Hertford. There was a very good OCD treatment centre very near me. So my psychiatrist was Professor Naomi Feinberg, who's a real sort of leading light. I had group cognitive behavioural therapy, and I was put on sertraline as well, which I still take. And I think what helped me the most from the therapy was, I think, although sort of the outside world tends to focus on the compulsions in OCD because it's sort of visible, and you can people who don't have an OCD can think they can understand what it would be like to have to perform these compulsions, really annoying and time consuming. But actually what really, really distressed me was the thoughts. It was I don't understand why I'm having these thoughts. And I think I thought that going to therapy or any kind of treatment would somehow make those thoughts stop. And that was the answer. And realizing quite early on in treatment that wasn't going to happen was a bit of a blow. But I think in time, what helped was the fact that everybody has these thoughts. So the thoughts aren't unique to OCD. It's the way that you respond and behave, which is the OCD, and that then gave me a route to target. Which it's not just me. That is how CBT for OCD works essentially, because you can't change your thoughts. The only thing you can change is your behavior. And it supported me and encouraged me to do that. I think now I'm probably, subclinical. I don't know. I haven't taken the test, the Yale Brown test, for a long time. It doesn't concern me in any way as severely as it used to. I think I still have the thoughts. I still have these obsessions, these sort of irrational ideas about how I might have caught HIV. But I now have the tools or the practice to be able to not indulge them and not perform the compulsions. And what that means is that essentially every day is a fresh start, which anyone who's had severe OCD will know. I mean, for me, the absolute worst time was that split second in the morning when you wake up and everything's fine, and then then suddenly you remember, and it all just comes crashing onto you like a ton of bricks. So I don't get that anymore, which is a huge step forward and a huge relief. So yeah, people say to me, "How are you doing now?" And I say, "Well, I have good days and bad days, and that's a lot better than only having bad days."
Yeah, absolutely. I guess while we're on the subjects, the learning that the point in your book that absolutely blew my mind was when you were talking about the research that had been done into, well, everyone has intrusive thoughts, like almost like that realization from psychologists. I learned that from your book. I guess just tell everyone a little bit about your book, because I do feel like there's a handful of books that were really important to me in, learning more about myself. But yours was almost top of the list, I think.
So when I had my therapy and started to feel a bit better, I think I wanted to know more about what had happened, a bit like I think you were describing, James, as a journalist. And I think I started thinking about OCD more as a journalist than as a patient. And I turned to books, because that's, I'm a writer, that's what I'm familiar with. And I found that of the books that were out there, they sort of divided into either books that were written by clinicians and were very accurate and precise, but didn't really describe what it was like to go through all of this from the other side, or they were written by people who almost were right in the teeth of having difficulties and almost written it as a form of therapy, very much about themselves and their own particular circumstances, which didn't really talk to me either about what I was going through. So I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity here. And, I'd always wanted to write a book, but I'd never really had a topic. And, and there was the topic. So the book is, I didn't want to write a book that was just about me. So one of the criticisms that I get of the book sometimes is people buy it expecting a memoir. Yeah. And it's frankly because I thought everyone else's, the more I read about the OCD, the more I thought everyone else's OCD was far more interesting than mine. And so I wanted to write, actually, this is true. When I gave my book agent a few pages, I'd written a scene in which, it's still in the book, but it's very different, where I have to do some checking, because one of my OCD was around blood, and I would have to check there was no blood there. And I'd sort of written it in this very visceral way of, repetition, essentially. And my agent read it and said, "Oh no, that's no good at all. It's just really boring to read." So imagine what it's like to go through, So, I've had this thing for 20 years, and she couldn't even bear to read 2 minutes of this sort of repetition. Yeah. So it became, it was a book. The book that I wanted to write was always about, I hate the phrase, but a popular science book. A book that actually looked at some of these big questions that I was asking myself. And my personal story, anyone who's written anything of any length will know that it's very hard to structure. So, it's very easy to write bits and pieces, and it's much more difficult to join them up. And it almost became, my personal stuff was a way of joining up the sort of the islands of fact, if you like. Yes. So that was the book.
And it's a cracker. And I think that I'll put a link to where people can get it from into the chat. Sorcha, do what everyone else has done, but for you.
Sure. So more similarly to Max and Joe, I think my OCD has kind of morphed and changed quite shapeshiftery over the years. But I think in the main, the stuff that's caused me most stress, especially as a child and then growing up, has been all my stuff was focused on like harm coming to the people I loved. So I was always worried that that would be my fault, that my parents would die, or like my mum would die in the night because I hadn't done something properly or put a certain amount of kisses on a text. So lots of like magical thinking stuff, which also then I think made it harder to spot, because it wasn't, a lot of the stuff that I was doing was in my head, wasn't necessarily like physical things. And so it had a huge impact on like my family life growing up. I was always waking up my parents and causing huge amounts of stress for my family. And then I was 20 and I was watching, I think it was like a Channel 4 documentary or something about teenagers with mental health conditions. And there was one girl on the program with OCD, and I was like, oh my God, it's my brain. And there was a real like weird light bulb moment of this girl having the exact same like inner workings as me. And so I think I got the internet and typed in like, what is OCD? Because I think until that point I'd only ever heard of OCD in the context of like, that's a bit OCD, somebody being a bit like tidy or fastidious, which I wasn't particularly. So I had never like recognized that at all. And I don't think I'd ever heard anyone talk about it in a context of like just what it actually is. So I did a Google and came across the charity OCD UK, who had like a page on their website that you could print out. So I printed it out and handed it to my GP and was like, I think I have this. And then kind of started the journey of recovery from there, which has been like a long one, but very worth it. I've been lucky enough to have therapy that's worked for me. And I think at first the idea of like tackling OCD or like starting to change how I was doing things was terrifying. But like as it's gone on, I can't, it's kind of odd really to think back to how my life was before, because I couldn't have, when I was really ill, I just couldn't possibly have envisaged, if that's a word, doing any of the things I can do now. Like I have a whole life and a job and like, you know, relationships and stuff, and that's all amazing. But it wouldn't have at all been possible when I was really, really ill.
While we're talking about therapy, let's talk about therapy a little bit, because I always present myself as a case study in what not to do. I guess for the benefit of anyone who is attending tonight who doesn't know me, roughly my story is that I had some obsessions when I was a child that when I look back, it was classic OCD, but I kept it to myself and no one knew about it. But when I was 19, I too decided one day that I was HIV positive. And it's interesting what you say, David, because when I was ringing the NHS direct line every night to speak to a nurse to reassure me that I couldn't have contracted HIV from a tattoo, which was kind of where it came from, they regularly said to me, "How old are you?" And I said, "Oh, you know, I was born in 1980." And they say, "Oh, do you remember the iceberg and the advert?" So they were aware that this was a thing, that kind of people who'd grown up in that era had these worries about it. But I got diagnosed with OCD when I was 28, which was 2008, and because, and this is the reason why I think it's so important to stop misinformation about OCD. I didn't believe I had OCD because I too wasn't particularly fastidious, or I wasn't particularly bothered about order and symmetry and all the things that, almost that memification of it was telling me that's what OCD was. And I basically went another 10 years just bouncing around at a pretty kind of high functioning level, but just bouncing around, just feeling horrendous and making mistakes. And until I got a diagnosis via OCD London, they kind of pointed me in the right direction when I was really flapping around. And then I got another diagnosis in 2018, and by that point I knew other people with OCD, and they could reassure me in a good way that I that I did have OCD. But in between that, I went to all manner of therapists who I think you would call psychoanalysts. So when I was talking to them about, I'm really worried that people might think I'm a paedophile, they dug into that. So they would ask, well, why would you think that, as opposed to this is OCD and we don't need to explore the content. And I think that actually where I'm at right now is trying to undo a lot of that. So it's a little bit more complicated for me than just, the CBT and the ERP, because just trying to kind of undo a lot of kind of clueless, naive people mucking about with my mind. I guess when we're talking about therapy, like how, Joe, you mentioned CADAT at the Maudsley. How, and you were saying about almost like the postcode lottery, and that's kind of how you got in. How did you find that they were the right people to work with, so to speak?
So like you, I had years of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis actually, before I had a proper diagnosis, because I was diagnosed with bog standard anxiety and depression. And I was already on sertraline, which, as we now know, is a very good med for OCD. But I was also in psychoanalysis, and I think a lot of people do this when they go for therapy. They just go, where can I get a therapist? They don't think like, what therapy is it, or what is this and what is that? So when I had my breakdown, I had to end the psychoanalysis because it was obviously a bad idea. I knew I had OCD when I started getting the weird thoughts about child abuse in my mid-30s, because a friend of mine had also had that. And so I did at least know that I could speak to the doctor and that I could say, look, it's OCD, because you couldn't, and the doctor was clued up. And then it was like, right, well, you need CBT. And I was soon plugged into kind of OCD Action, OCD UK, and the kind of various OCD charities. And it was obvious what I needed. And in fact, although I live in the London Borough of Southwark, and that was kind of, it's down the road to my house, I was actually referred as, I can't remember what it's called now. My brain is fried. Oh, a HSS, that's it, a HSS patient, so highly specialised service, because I met a very, very high threshold in a really severe depression scale, a really severe Yale-Brown score. I'd been on 2 different antidepressants and an antipsychotic. So I met this really high threshold, which basically meant that I got seen earlier and it didn't have to go to CCG. So it was down the road from my house, and I've been in the Maudsley and stuff, right? So it's all on the same site. But yeah, I was really lucky. I think a lot of people, and I still see people now saying, well, where do I need to go and what do I need to do and how do I do this and that? So a lot of the problems I think we have is just kind of this this kind of opaque referral process and the different ways you can do it. But yeah, I mean, CADAT is just incredible. And there's obviously at the moment, it's the residential centre isn't open for people who don't live in London, who can't commute in and do it weekly. But I think for me, doing it weekly was really important. And then we spread out my sessions. So I saw Fiona for a year, but I only had 20 sessions. So it was like a week apart, 2 weeks apart. And by the end, it was 6 weeks apart. But that gave me time to kind of undo all of these, not only toxic behaviours related to my OCD and worries about specific things, but also just like, oh, like it's fine to take a day and go and sit in the park and have a picnic. Like it's fine to do the stuff. It's fine not to sort of, I don't know, do all the stuff that I was doing and just doing stuff because other people wanted me to do other stuff. I do stuff because I want to do it. And it takes a lot of time. So they always say Paul Tchaikovsky, who's probably like, along with David Beale, the kind of the Gandalf and the Dumbledore of OCD, aren't they? But Paul always says that most of the work you do in CBT with an OCD patient is undoing collateral damage because you waited so long for a diagnosis and you've missed out on so much in life. And I'm glad that I haven't missed out on too much myself, but I know people who've just missed out on so much, and it breaks my heart, really, it does.
Yeah, no, totally. Max, you were saying that you'd seen a lot of different therapists. Would you say that was because you hadn't found the right one, or because you felt like you needed that many?
I think a little bit of both. I think the first 2 therapists I saw were both very good. But I suppose at that time my OCD was still trying to work out, if you will, what was really making me tick and what the worst thing was that it could use. And I know seem to be giving it a sort of intelligence here, but that is kind of how it felt for me, and I'm sure other sufferers as well. But I always needed to go back to therapy every time it became particularly severe. And once I caught on the theme of child abuse, I did have to spend quite a long time undergoing CBT, and it went on longer than I think the sort of standard is for the NHS. And I remember it was a psychologist I saw at the Bethlehem Royal. So I live in Croydon, and that's on our doorstep in Croydon. And she was excellent. She was very, very good, and she was very challenging. And I think that's what I always carry with me with CBT. It's almost like the psychiatric equivalent of a slap round the face. That's how it always felt to me, because it can be pretty brutal at times. And with exposure response prevention, if, for example, you're afraid of going to a particular location because you associate it with one of your obsessions, then this therapist I saw, she would say, well, your homework for the next week is to go there a couple of times, and you're going to make a journal of it, and you're going to write down how you respond to it and how you feel about it. And it almost felt a little bit like I was back in school. And I suppose that's kind of what CBT was for me. It was an education about how I could respond to OCD in a way which wasn't going to leave me just absolutely torn up and paralyzed in bed all day long because I was so terrified about doing anything at all. And that particular course of CBT, when I was probably in my early 20s, worked an absolute treat. A few years later, I went to another therapist, and it was a group therapy this time round, and I had lots of reservations about it, and I thought, it's the NHS, they're just trying to cram us all together so they can get us all sorted out to the best of their ability, all at once, instead of just giving you that one-on-one time. But the more I got into it, the more I found I was actually quite enjoying it. And it was really helpful to actually speak directly to other people in the same room about their experience of OCD, and just to realise that, this isn't just unique to me. This is something that is affecting a lot of people, and just to have those contacts and be able to build that and build a rapport with all those people in the same room was really quite rewarding. So for me, out of the different times that I've had therapy, it was those two, and they were really quite different. So a group sessions worked very well, and also that quite brutal one-to-one therapy was also very good as well.
While we're here, tell everyone a little bit about your book. I know I pledged because you crowdfunded it, didn't you? Tell me a little bit about, kind of how that came about and what you want to achieve with that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly why I got to that point where I thought I'm quite comfortable to start writing about this. But when I was a child and I knew I'd been diagnosed with OCD, I was a big reader, and I started scanning around for any books where there was a character with OCD. I didn't really find any. Subsequently, since I was a child, there have been some depictions of OCD in a main character in children's fiction, which is great. The problem for me, though, is that a lot of it has been focused on cleanliness and hygiene, and I never really saw any depictions of OCD dealing with some of the more unpleasant stuff, what we would call repugnant obsessions. So along the things of violence and things like that. So I wanted to write a book that would speak to children who have those kind of taboo obsessions, and do it in a way where, speaking from my own experience, I could deal with it quite delicately, because, if you have a child who has violent images in their head, putting that into sort of middle grade fiction, it has to be done in a certain way, because there's only so much you can get away with. And, just because you're a child, it doesn't mean you can't have adult thoughts. but there is a specific way of doing that. And so a couple of years ago, I started writing Rory Hobble and the Voyage to Hallygoggin. And
which, by the way, is going to be an absolute treat for sub-editors when they're reviewing your book.
I think I'm hopeful. I'm quietly optimistic. But yeah, it's doing something which I haven't seen done in fiction before, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or anything. I specifically wrote it for me as a child because that was not a book I saw. Yeah. And I think estimates now are as high as 1 in 100 children have OCD, which is the same kind of figure as autistic spectrum disorder. So you see so much more about something like ASD and other conditions, but not so much about OCD and the different permutations of it. So that's what I've done with my book. I've put a boy front and center who is having violent, intrusive images. They're very unsettling, very unpleasant, but I hope I'm dealing with it in a mature enough way.
Sorcha, I guess that kind of bridges a bit to something I wanted to ask you, which is that, as a creative person who has written a play, what kind of challenges have you found in depicting OCD? Particularly because, almost like a bit of what Max is talking about here, I think that when thoughts are intrusive, when they are not seen, so to speak, it's a challenging thing to try and depict that.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I think also, like, part of the reason why as a kid I never talked about what was going on with me was, as well as the fact that I was just hugely scared that I would be like ostracized and like cast out and judged, I was also just like didn't really have the language and the words to describe how I felt or like what the thoughts were or what was going on. So I think then when it came to like many years later putting it on stage, it was kind of like how to capture the feeling of what that is, and I guess just a bit of trial and error really. And like my play has a lot of like audience interaction in, which was something that like again we tried with and without and developed, but we wanted to find a way to like allow the audience to experience it as well as just watch it, that feeling of what it's like to be stuck in that like spiral of intrusive thoughts and the kind of just the how something completely irrational can feel very like an irrational fear can feel completely real. I feel like whenever I go back to talking about OCD, it's all words like spirals and like twisting and like vortex. It's all very like that kind of feeling, because I think that's how I felt when I was really ill, like spiraling down a huge black hole, like a tangly sort of hole. But I think it's been very surreal then, because I kind of wrote the play I didn't particularly intend to write something about somebody with OCD. I just wanted it to be truthful, and then realized as I was writing about experiences that I'd had that OCD was very tangled through that. There we go, tangled again. But and so I think that then it's almost because of making that show that I've then started talking about having OCD and becoming a lot more just like open about what I've experienced. And it's been really like overwhelming and lovely to, whenever I've done the show, like to chat to people afterwards who have had the same experience. Because I think at first I just was, because I think OCD feels so personal to you because the fears are so wrapped up in what you care about, that I just went my whole childhood assuming that nobody else would ever feel anything like that. Or so I think it's been really heartening for other people to be like, I've had that too. Yeah,
totally. David, I'm not there's no specific reason I'm asking you this. It's just I'm trying to cover everything that I would like to get through. We've talked a little bit about collateral damage. How have you found your OCD has been for people around you, people who are close to you?
So when I wrote the book, my wife read it and went, "Oh shit." I think because it's a very difficult question to answer, because of course there's only me, that there's no version of me that doesn't have OCD, so I don't know how all my relationships and all my interactions with people would have gone differently. I think what I can say is that for a long time, so sorry, I keep answering a question by going deeper and deeper down a rabbit hole.
Oh, that's good, man.
But
classic OCD.
to me, the sort of the negative implications of OCD were two. There was sort of the direct implications, which was, in my case, I was scared shitless of catching what I thought was a horrible disease, with all the anxiety that came with that. But there was also an indirect effect that I always thought, if I wasn't thinking about this, if I didn't have this thought, if I wasn't obsessed with this, I would be living my life so differently. I would be doing this, I'd be making different decisions, I'd be able to enjoy this, I'd commit to that, I wouldn't miss out on that. And so part of that is that every conversation you have with someone, you're second guessing yourself, thinking, you know, you put distance between the person that you are pretending to be, in a way, by not saying, actually, I don't care about any of that shit. All that's going on in my head right now is this. You know, so talking about films and music and books and politics and art and which girls you fancy or whatever, all that kind of stuff, you know, which you should be fully engaged in. I wasn't. I describe it as being a bit like an autopilot. You know, there was somebody there kind of turning the wheel, but they weren't flying the plane. And that was because I hadn't told anybody about it. It was a secret. And that was putting distance between me and all of my, if you like, authentic experiences. And by being open about it, that has completely dissolved. So I no longer feel that there's that gap, reality gap, between the person who people think I am and the person that I know I am really. So that's definitely helped. I think, you know, my wife will say that, you know, she can tell when I'm having a bad OCD moment, and it kind of it's become the sort of default thing to blame when we have an argument. You know, it's all down to the OCD. But I think, I mean, you know, not that they're aware of it, but my children, that was the reason I went for help eventually, was that I was I found myself involving my baby daughter in some of my rituals and thoughts. And that was the point at which I thought, no, this has to stop. I will do anything. You know, I kind of not happy, but I was come to terms with the fact that it was going to be part of my life, but I didn't want it to be part of hers. So it's a bit of a long-winded question, really. But to be honest, it's partly why I didn't really put my relationships with other people in the book, because I didn't think it was, I didn't really feel like it was my place to sort of try and imagine how it made them feel. And certainly, I almost felt like I owed people an apology, because, you know, if I'd had a friend who turns out was going through something like that was so big and so important, and they'd never told me about it, then I would sort of question how much I really knew them. And you know, it sounds horribly self-centered, but there are people I know who have died. You know, I only met them when I had OCD, and they died before I got better, and I never saw them again. And so, you know, that entire relationship I had with that person, to me, was kind of fraudulent in a way.
Yeah. Well, I feel very silly putting there will be some laughs on the invite. Man, thanks for that. Sorcha, can you tell me, has everyone just been muted?
Just by ourselves.
Oh, okay, right.
So there's not too much.
I thought I'd done something ludicrous. Sorcha, I went to this amazing talk, the OCD UK conference, that was you and your mum talking about your relationship throughout your experience with OCD. Tell me a little bit about when you felt supported by people like family or friends. What advice for anyone who is close to someone with OCD? How can they help them?
I think it's really tricky, and I think, like other people have mentioned, once I started to get better, I just had like huge grief about all the stuff I'd missed out on and all the kind of impacts that being ill had on my close people. But I think maybe for like people, it's hard, isn't it, for people supporting someone with OCD. I think just like be there and listen. I think a huge thing is like shame and fear about this stuff going on in your head being horrible or violent or weird or scary. And I think just like having people to like just show that they're still there for you is just hugely, enormously helpful. Because I think OCD is a really lonely thing. It makes you feel like you're on your own, and especially because a lot of my stuff was to do with responsibility and like protecting other people. So I really felt super lonely. And so I think just knowing that there were people there for me, like, was meant the difference between like being able to then survive it, I guess. And I think also like doing stuff, if you're supporting someone with OCD, like doing stuff that's not defined by them having OCD, like doesn't have to be something you talk about all the time, or like if just go and any kind of quality time, like have a cup of tea with them, go for a walk with them, like just ring them up and talk about something silly. I think just like, because when I'd been diagnosed with OCD, I kind of felt like it was my whole, suddenly that's who I was, and like that's what people saw me as. I think just like showing that you just see they're still the person that you care about. And also I think, like, I don't know if there are people here supporting people with OCD, but like just looking after yourself as well, and like making sure you're okay, because looking after somebody with a mental health condition or mental illness can be just exhausting and devastating. And I think just like making sure that you have the time to make sure you're all right too.
Joe, you're sort of no pressure, but you've sort of become a little bit of my OCD oracle. I quite often turn to you when, I feel like you're further ahead in the queue of trying to make some sense of all this.
Okay.
Can you tell people why reassurance is a very bad thing?
I don't think reassurance is a bad thing. I think we all need reassurance. We're all human.
Yeah.
So if I want to know if I look nice in my dress, I might say to my boyfriend, "Do I look nice in this?" And he'll say, "Yeah, you look nice in it," or he'll say, "Maybe change it." And that's normal, right? But if I'm really obsessed with how I look, and I am asking him time and time again, the problem with reassurances is that it's a short-term hit. It's like scratching an itch. It's a short-term hit. It makes things wrong because you're never, ever going to be satisfied with the answer. Even if I say to someone like, "Am I a murderer?" and they say no, I'm like, okay, fine. But I'm never going to be satisfied with that. And that's what OCD knows this. It just takes and takes and takes and takes and takes and takes and takes. So it's like scratching an itch. And what you need to do is just wait for that itch to start to fade. That's kind of yeah. And so I think, following on as well from Sorcha's point about, talking about supporting people with OCD, a lot of people who care for their loved ones and who look after family members or partners or what have you with OCD do become unwitting allies to the OCD, and in ways that aren't obvious, because OCD is very sneaky, and it will always find ways of trying to kind of so you can indulge someone's OCD in a way that isn't helpful. However, that is difficult, because if you've got a child who won't leave the house for school until they've been reassured about something, what do? Do you sit there all day until the child's put their shoes on and gone out? Or do you say, right, for the sake of getting the child to school, I'm just going to do it, and we kind of deal with the thing. So reassurance in itself isn't bad. We all need reassurance. We are all imperfect lumps of meat with far too much cortisol inside our bodies, frankly. And so we all need reassurance, all of us. But it's when it becomes compulsive.
Right. So
it's like, if I say, I never ask reassurance on anything these days. I've become a little bit of a sort of no reassurance ever. But if I say like, one time reassurance, fine. Have I upset you? Have I offended you? I've got a friend with OCD who's often very much, "I've upset you, I've upset you." It's like, you're just annoying me now. You're annoying me because you're asking me if you've upset me continually. Ask me once, fine. Leave it there and move on. But it is really difficult when you are in that spiral, I think, as we all know.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a really good book as well, Loving Someone with OCD, that people who are caring for others can buy and read and get use from. I recommend it.
I'm sure Danielle will find a link for that. Max,
yeah.
Tell us, one of the questions I always like to ask on the OCD Chronicles, Danielle, feel free to put a URL for that as well, is what one piece of advice would you give to a new diagnosis? Would you mind answering that?
Yeah, so I've been asked this a couple of times actually, and I think there are always two things I go back to. One, which I think most people would say, and it's not empty, and that's things can get better, and they will get better. just hang in there, because there will be times when it feels like there is no escape. And as Saoirse said, it does feel like the loneliest place in the world when you are completely wrapped up in your OCD and you see no way out. And it's those moments you just need to cling on to a bit of hope, because it does get better, and it can. The other thing which I always advise, and which worked for me, was whenever I woke up in the morning and there was that moment, I think as Dave mentioned, when it hits you and you remember, oh yeah, the OCD's there, this is my life, this is what I've got to endure for the rest of the day. OCD kind of breaks your sense of time, and it's difficult to see past a minute, past an hour, past a day, past a week. And I think to try and root yourself and ground yourself back into a sense of time is to try and find something small to look forward to each day. And it can be something utterly pathetic, but as long as it works for you, then it's doing its job. And for me, as a kid, I remember I loved EastEnders, and I've gotten better, and I don't like EastEnders very much anymore.
No, I'm not. Let me just block you and just keep.
Yeah. Well, that would be fair. And when I woke up, I would look forward to the fact that there was an episode of EastEnders to watch later that evening, and I would think, okay, well, I just need to keep going, because the longer I keep going, the less time there is until there is this thing which I'm looking forward to, and it becomes sort of like a small milestone to reach. And I would put a little milestone to reach in my days, every single day. And that would just help me get through it. And it would break down the time into manageable little chunks. When I had just that little thing to look forward to, that little thing that I felt safe enjoying, and it doesn't have to be much, and it often isn't very much at all. That's what worked for me. And that would be a key bit of advice I would give anyone who's just been diagnosed.
What I'm going to say is far more important than anything we've talked about this evening. I would just like to clarify that EastEnders is my favourite TV programme. And I don't, there was no criticism of you watching EastEnders. It was more the criticism of EastEnders that made me think, okay, Max can go now. I did, however, write an article for the Guardian Guide about 2 weeks ago critiquing their OCD storyline, which is a bit of a mess. Right, so I guess we've got about half an hour. We've got a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A, but if anyone's got anything in the chat that they'd like anyone to answer, then please do type something into the chat now, or if you'd like it to be anonymous, put it in the Q&A. So one question we've got, which I thought was a really good one, and someone has actually answered it, which is cool, but there was someone who wanted to know how, if they know, if there is someone who is close to them and they care about, who they feel like needs help, they can almost see some of the traits that we've been talking about and they need help, but they're not willing to go, they're not willing to seek that help, or they don't quite understand what's happening to them. Do you think there's a way, do you have any advice for anyone in that situation? Yeah, go for it, Joe. It's an open question to anyone.
Yeah, it's really difficult. It's like any problem. It's like whether if someone's got, an alcohol problem or an addiction problem or anything, people have to want the help. And I think, OCD doesn't want you to get better, right? So you can be very defensive. I mean, I was desperate to get better just because it was just torturing me. But I think for a lot of people who are stuck in their compulsions and thinking that they're keeping them safe, it is really difficult. And I think, you can get to the point where you get pushed away and stuff. So it is really, really difficult. And I don't think there's one single answer. But if people don't want help, they don't want help. But I think you can offer them information and let them know that you're happy to sort of support them through whatever they want to do. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. And I think a lot of people with OCD have lost friends. I think and it's something that's extremely regrettable, but that's what this horrible thing does to us. So, but yeah, it is really difficult. So yeah, solidarity basically with anyone going.
Yeah, totally. I think that one thing I'd like to make clear is like to having a small profile as a journalist or someone in media, lots of followers on Twitter, whatever. And talking about OCDs, I do now quite regularly get people who will reach out and ask me questions about OCD. And what I always try to say to them is that I feel really uncomfortable with that responsibility, in that I'm not an expert on OCD. I'm just an expert on my life. And what I always try to do is to push them to OCD UK and OCD Action, who I just think are we're very lucky that there's two great charities. So that would be my advice, to seek out those organisations if there's someone who you're close to, you feel like needs that help.
Yeah, I think I would just add. So I answered in the chat, and it was very brief, and it probably sounds a bit dismissive, saying you can't really, but I think it's worth drilling into it a little bit, thinking, well, why don't they want that help, or why are they not willing to get that help, or why do they not think that they need that help? And I think, as we've discussed, there's often a very long delay between even people who are diagnosed with OCD getting help. And the way I sort of envisage it is, or think about it, is that there's basically a sequence of hurdles between anyone who has got OCD and then getting the help. And one of those hurdles is recognizing what it is going on. And James, you talked about how you fell at that hurdle because OCD is represented as something very different, so you don't recognize it. One of the hurdles that I had was that I just didn't think it would work. I said, what's the point? It feels very real to me. This does not feel like OCD. This feels like I've got a genuine reason to be frightened of this horrible disease, and that is never going to change.
Yeah.
So why? It's not like they can fix it. So why even try? Sometimes people just don't want to sort of face up to what's going on. It's easier just to sort of push it away. And one of the reasons I didn't seek help for a long time was I just thought it would go away by itself, because it was so weird and so wrong, and I knew it didn't make any sense. And most of my life, I'd been pretty much in control of what I was thinking, and I was able to think quite rationally about most things. And I thought that would happen with this. And so every day it became easier just to put it off. So although the person, you can't help them in terms of making them better, because you're not a fully trained OCD expert. So that's what I meant in my response. You can't help them any more than you could help them if they had a cancer or a heart problem. Yeah. But I think what you can do is talk around the issue and if possible, work out exactly what it is that's blocking them from either being ready to go for that help or even just realizing that they need it.
That's really good, man. There's a question here which I think is something that I do relate to from my not too distant past, which is a little bit about kind of fighting for a diagnosis, really. I think that I'm still amazed to this day how many people missed it. And it wasn't until I went to like specialist kind of services that they gave me a name for it. How important do you think a diagnosis is, like an official diagnosis? And anyone can answer. I'll pick on Joe. Joe, you answer.
How important is an official diagnosis?
Yeah.
I think it's really validating. I can only speak for myself, but I think a lot of people talk about labels and stigma and psychiatric illnesses and stuff. And I think OCD is one where we can all agree, probably all of us, at least the five of us, can agree that it's really liberating to know that you're not actually a psychopath, right? In my case, anyway, that I'm not actually a paedophile or a child murderer or any of these other awful labels I could have for myself. Actually, it's OCD. So I think I'm hearing that from because OCD is basically a doubt problem. Having it from a professional is really important. The only problem is when your do I have OCD or not becomes an OCD worry in itself, and then you have to keep checking. So there's obviously that problem with it. We've all doubted that we have OCD, because if we didn't doubt we had OCD, then we wouldn't have OCD. So for me, extremely validating. And of course, it's having that diagnosis that enabled me to get my treatment, and enables me to kind of, I don't know, go, if anyone does actually ever, if anyone mistakes the content of my intrusive thoughts for something that they're really not, at least, having that diagnosis is something that says, actually, no, this is the problem. And I am a bit funny about, I've been called a gatekeeper about diagnosis before in terms of official diagnosis, because I do think so many people will say, I'm a bit OCD, without realizing what it means. I think we have become quite protective. I can be possibly quite protective about who gets to kind of use those words and who doesn't, so that can also be helpful. But at the same time, it can be really hard to get diagnosed, especially if people in the States and in that don't have what we have. So yeah, it is tricky, but I found it incredibly useful and liberating. So.
No, totally. Yeah, I guess there's a question. I'm sort of bastardizing the question really, but there's someone in the Q&A who has asked Max about kind of reading, like searching kind of articles about the stone throwing and things like that. Like, I guess what I'm going to try and spin that into is, does anyone have any advice for the resistance of their compulsions?
I'm happy to jump in there. I'll give you a moment. Yeah. I think this is where exposure response prevention came in for me, with the actual clinical side of things, and the professional help. I think when you sort of give yourself allowances of what you're going to do with a compulsion each day, and sort of wean yourself off it almost. So for example, let's say today I'm going to allow myself to search for online articles or through the newspaper for something I may have done 5 times, but tomorrow I'm only going to do it 4 times, and then the next day 3 times, etc., and so forth. So you're just gently trying to wean yourself off. You're not going cold turkey and saying, right, I'm just going to stop doing it, because that is really, really difficult, and you need to make yourself some allowance there. So for me personally, with that stone throwing, and I imagine for other people with different compulsions as well, it is just about gently weaning yourself off and having a strong plan that you might actually write down and tick off. So there's a lot of reflection in there as well. You're being reflective about your behavior, your compulsions, what you're actually doing, and keeping a record, which can be quite helpful, because you can look back on it later and think, okay, well, look, I can do it. I've recorded it, and I've made notes of how I've done it. So it is possible.
That's great. Saoirse, do you have something you want to add there?
Kind of, yeah, just very similar stuff, really. I think just, I think one of the last compulsions that I was doing was like searching things on the internet, and I think it took me a really long time to work out that it was to do with OCD and not just a general thing, because we're also used to searching stuff on the internet. But I think for me, and maybe this is just a personal thing, but I think for me what I found really helpful in terms of the exposure response prevention stuff has been, instead of trying not to do something, it's been about like replacing it with something. And if that makes sense. So for me, it's kind of been like a challenge. So instead of just not doing the OCD thing, it's been doing something that almost challenges the OCD on purpose. And so I think that kind of like gave me a bit of drive, because it felt more like I was active rather than passive in my own like spiraling or whatever. So for me, something that was like, I was really worried that my mum would die in the night. And so with my therapist, we worked up to this. We didn't do this straight away, but we worked out that, and agreed it with my mum, that I would tell her before nighttime that I hoped she died in the night. And I was convinced that she was going to die. It was terrifying. It was one of the most scary things ever. But then the next morning when she woke up and obviously was fine, it was one of the most liberating things. So I think being able to, and that was really supported by like CBT and a therapist who I felt safe with. And that had I had therapy for like 2.5 years. It took a really long time to get there. But I think it's that finding stuff that made me feel like active in my own recovery rather than just passive and stuff happening to me.
Thanks for that, mate. There's someone in the Q&A who's asked about kind of other disorders or other conditions, and I very recently got diagnosed with an eating disorder, which is totally connected to my OCD. Is my gut. Does anyone have any advice on? I mean, Joe, you were talking about that you've had issues with depression. Like,
Oh, yeah.
almost like, how do you treat those conditions in tandem? Like, how do they lift treatment of?
It was extremely difficult when I had my breakdown because, you know, the advice that you're getting all the time is keep distracted, keep busy, keep occupied. Well, how do you do that when you can barely clean your teeth? You know, you've got this horrible OCD attacking you because it's got an open goal. But then you've got this depression that just kind of takes any motivation and any kind of enjoyment. It's like it is dementor, isn't it? It sucks that kind of enjoyment and motivation and kind of purpose out of everything. Luckily, of course, sertraline is good in my case. You know, not everybody likes meds. That's up to them. My meds have saved my life and keep me stable. No one ever wants to hear this, but it's the truth. And you know, sertraline is an SSRI. It's an antidepressant, but it's also very, very good for OCD. And so that helps, and that kind of taking that time to kind of do that. Again, you know, because the OCD kind of comes in with the depression, it's a case of saying, okay, so I need to make sure that I don't, you know, I eat vegetables and get a good night's sleep and don't drink alcohol and all of those things that kind of keep me well. I think it can become much, much more complicated. For example, CASAT won't accept people who have bipolar disorder and OCD where the bipolar needs treating first because of psychosis. And so there are, you know, borderline personality disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, very politicized diagnosis. I'm not going to go into that now, but ultimately this can be a diagnosis that excludes you from all kinds of care for other things, which I think is frankly criminal. I think it's, you know, to use a diagnosis in a way that is abusive and to kind of cause iatrogenic neglect is absolutely disgraceful. In terms of my neurodivergent side of things, so elements of autism and ADHD, I'd say that OCD is often comorbid with these things. And the difference between autism and OCD is, and I've got a nephew who's quite high on the autism spectrum, is that I see him doing his rituals and he's so happy, just doing what he wants to do. He's sorting out my mum's paper clips in different colours. It's great, keeps him busy, you know, very easily entertained. Whereas if he was doing that because of OCD, it would be in response to a distressing thought. And this is not distress, it's just what he likes to do. And so when I go to the food bank and I sort out all of the things that I like to sort out with a date order, it makes me incredibly happy. It's got nothing to do with intrusive thoughts. And those are the differences, but they can often be mistaken for each other. But they're often also comorbid. So it's difficult. But there's no such thing as too complex or untreatable, no matter what anyone says.
Yeah, I guess, Danielle, if you get a moke, would you mind just putting the link to the organisation that Joe is involved in, Mad COVID, just in the chat, the link? I mean, one of the things that I've learned so much from you, Joe, is you're really good at articulating your frustrations with mental health systems. Like,
yeah.
That was a really polite way of putting it. Would you talk a little bit about, well, what you feel needs to be done, but I guess that would be more pertinent to people who are here tonight, how to navigate those systems?
Don't vote Tory. Don't vote Tory, because ultimately what we've seen over the last 10 years is not only a destruction of, you know, the welfare state and the kind of social systems that we had that were already creaking, but, you know, there's a term called parity of esteem. I don't know if you've heard this, where everyone's saying, oh, but, you know, mental health should be treated as well as physical health. Well, last time I checked, people with physical health problems were being gaslit and denied care as well. So it's more, I call it a parity of esteem, which I think is a much better way of putting it. But ultimately, the whole system is unfit for purpose in so many ways. Obviously, I've had good treatment at CASA. I'm not saying that, you know, it's all bad. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we have a system where if you are in a mental health crisis, and I've been this person, I have been this person as someone who's privileged, white, heterosexual, educated to PhD level, all of that stuff. If you're in a mental health crisis, especially if it's a weekend or it's A&E or nothing, and you go to A&E, imagine turning up, I want to say this to people who've never had a mental health problem, imagine turning up at A&E after being run over by a car and then going, I just go home and have a bath. And I really don't like these comparisons of physical health, but I need people to realise how terrible it is that when you are in a mental crisis, you are treated like you can be treated like you are just the worst person on earth. And people say ask for help, and I just find it quite galling. Who do you want me to speak to then? Oh, you're going to give me the number for the Samaritans? Thanks very much. And this is a problem as well with these shallow awareness things that are all about, oh, just ask for help, it'll be fine. Talk about it over work. Oh yeah, so I'm going to go and sit down with my sandwiches in the lunchroom at work and talk about how, you know, I might fancy my dad, but I can't quite work it out, and it's taken me a while to figure out, you know. And it's like, people don't want to hear that stuff. They want to hear nice recovery stories, and unfortunately, you know, that isn't how everyone's story works. And mine does have that nice kind of dip and kind of recovery kind of, oh, isn't it great? But ultimately, that's not how it is for a lot of people, and certainly not when they are given diagnoses that exclude them. Like, I'm again talking about borderline personality disorder, that exclude them from, you know, a lot of services that actually encourage iatrogenic abuse from doctors. And there's been studies done by this, for example, by Paul Tarkovskis. Now, Mad COVID is basically saying what we wanted to do was document people's experiences of the pandemic in real time. So diaries and all this kind of thing, and the hardship funds happened, and all of this other stuff happened. It's become massive in just under a year. But ultimately what we're seeing is that, you know, COVID's played out exactly like we said it would, along existing fault lines. And it's mentally ill people are one of the groups who are at the very sharp end of this, be it because they were disabled people who begged for digital access to services for years and were told, you can't have it, you can't have it. And suddenly it's foisted on everybody when COVID happens, never mind the fact that it's not suitable for everybody. And so it's incredibly frustrating. And, you know, I think there's a very big difference between how people who've been in secondary care and who've been admitted to mental hospitals think about the NHS and think about mental health services, and people who haven't. And so, yeah, I am angry, but I don't think it's bad to be angry. I think, if you're not angry, then what are you going to change if you're not using that anger?
I mean,
I found it so difficult, and I'm so privileged.
I mean,
what's it like for people that don't have what I've got?
I mean, at the risk of making you more angry, have you just tried meditation?
I have tried meditation. It's something that works fine for some people. It's not a panacea, and it's certainly not something you tell people who are poorly to do. You don't tell someone on a mental health ward, go meditate. It's neglectful. And this unicornification, as you call it. But yeah, if meditation helps you, great, do it. But it's not for me.
Yeah, in my case, it was why don't you try crochet? So cheers for that, Doc.
Well, I could at least fantasize about stabbing people in the eyes with a crochet needle if they recommend it once more. But
totally.
It's not helpful.
There's another question in the chat where someone is saying that they have OCD. They haven't been down the avenues that we've talked about tonight, CBT, ERP, but they feel like they manage it in their own way. And I guess they're asking the question, should they keep doing what they're doing because they feel like it's working, or should they seek what you would call, almost like the gold standard, that kind of treatment? And I guess that my answer, before I kind of bat to anyone, is that I think if they're asking that question, there's probably some doubt in their mind. But can anyone kind of, it's a tricky one, but does anyone have any advice for that person? Yeah, go for it, Sorcha.
It's a tricky question, and I'm not a professional. I'm just a human being. But I think I just want to say, like, if you want to get more support, you absolutely deserve that. And it is really tricky to access that. But I think for me, and maybe for other people here, like having a diagnosis was really liberating and allowed me to connect with other people. But ultimately, it is up to you. And if you're happy with how you are, nobody can force you to do anything. I think it's just finding what works for you, and that's like a very long trial and error process sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I think I'll just follow that up actually as well, in the, as someone who did all of the wrong things for so long and kind of just accepted that that's what life was. I mean, just for the context of anyone who doesn't know me, who is here tonight, during this time, I worked at the New Musical Express at the NME as the features editor, which is kind of pretty high up the masthead. I edited Kerrang magazine, the rock magazine. I did that for 6 years. I think a lot of people would have looked at me and gone, "He's doing all right," and I wasn't doing all right. I was just losing my mind, and sometimes getting myself in scrapes because of it. And I had just kind of accepted that I didn't know a different way, and I certainly know that, whilst I still find things very challenging now, I do know that since I have been to CADAT and been to the Maudsley and connected with people in this group and other people who've been on the website and so on, and probably most importantly, found a support group. The one I attend is called London OCD, which is run by a guy called Stephen Hoskins, and has some amazing volunteers who help him. That really kind of plucked me out of the fog of not knowing what to do and put me in the right direction. I would recommend a support group to anyone. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'd kind of convinced myself that I was dealing with it in an okay way, and I wasn't dealing with it in an okay way. And I think that's sometimes one of the things that's very complicated with OCD, is that they call it the doubting disease for a reason. It's extremely tricksy. I guess just as we come towards the end, do you guys have anything? I guess let's go around and say, can you all just say something which would instill some hope in some people who are as lost as perhaps you'd been along the way in your own journey? Let's start with Max.
Look at us. We're all here talking about OCD and our experience of it. That's proof that there is a way through it, and even if you're still going through it and struggling, there is such a cliche, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. Perseverance is key, and there is a level of endurance involved. But I look back on how I was as a kid, and when I was a bit younger as well as an adult. I couldn't see a way out of it, but there was a way out of it. There is a way forward, and you just got to hang in there with OCD. It is such a battle every single day, but it is one you can win. And I would just encourage you to keep going. Reach out for support where you can. Connect with organisations like OCD Action, OCD UK. Speak to other people who are going through the same thing, and even if you are that lonely person on your own with no one else around you, no friends, no family, let's think about the worst case scenario. There are other people you can reach out to, and a lot of the time they are just a couple of clicks or a phone call away.
David.
I think I would say, I obviously agree with what Max has said. I think I would say there has never been a better time to be born and to have OCD. There are people out there who are talking about what's going on. There are people trying to understand you. There are people who are spending their entire professional lives trying to help people like you. Now, I fully accept Joe's criticisms of the system, and we've all been relatively lucky, and I know a lot of people aren't. The people are out there. It's just a case of the access is not, is not equitable. But we are probably the first generation that can say that. Someone was talking about crochet needles. If any of us had been diagnosed with OCD in the 50s, those crochet needles would have been hammered into our eye sockets, and our brain would have been turned to mush as frontline treatment for OCD. So it's really fucking hard. It's a severe mental illness, and we should we should give ourselves a break in that it's really difficult. And people have suffered with this throughout history. And most people have never, ever had the chance to get to feel better because no one cared, no one knew what to do. And both of those things have now changed. To me, that's hopeful.
No, it's really good, man. Joe?
Yeah, I think I'd obviously echo what Max and David have both said. While the system needs improvement, I think the treatment that is available, if you can get it, is absolutely brilliant. So I really wasn't obviously meaning to knock that. And I think you're correct in that, I think since 2000, even since then, things have really come on. I think what I want to add to that is that OCD is a bully. Okay, so OCD is a bully. It's a bully that takes your school lunch money, and it's going to keep taking that school lunch money if you let it. But it's also a coward. It's a really massive coward. And I have learned to laugh at my OCD. I can say my OCD, something awful will pop into my brain, like did I once have sex with my brother? And I can just turn around and go, that's really funny. And actually being able to laugh at how ridiculous that is. And as I say, I was in a very, very bad place, and I very nearly didn't get there. And it's down to the fact that I had the treatment that I needed, but ultimately there's always hope, always hope. And I think, as Max said, we're all sat here and we're all doing all right. So yeah, just hang in there and go to support groups and stuff like that, because they're always very well facilitated.
Sorcha, come on, take us home.
Okay. Just echoing what everybody else has said, really. But I think for me, something that's really helped is just like one step at a time, be super kind to yourself, because you can be the person to be really lovely to yourself. And I think something that I've learned is that a wobble doesn't mean you're back at square one, even though it emotionally feels exactly like that. I've had days where I've woken up and I've been like, oh my God, these years of work has come to nothing, but it doesn't. You've got the skills. And just, thanks, Joe has put in the chat, it is okay to be nice to yourself in caps locks. And that is true. And I think some of the skills that I've learned from tackling and beating OCD have come in really handy, for example, in the pandemic or like in other situations. And that's not in a kind of wishy-washy, like look at the positives way, because it's a devastating thing. But I think it's just, if you can, it's a really brave thing to do, to acknowledge something and to start dealing with it. And I think if you can start doing that, you're in a really good place, and there is always hope.
Thank you so much to everyone who has spoken tonight. You are literally all of my heroes. I'm trying to think of a superhero team which has got 5 people in it. There was the Fantastic Four did have like a kind of robot dog thing. So I'm not gonna say who that is, but Joe, feel free to be the robot dog. I think it was like an alien dog. Anyway. Thank you so much to you guys. Thank you to everyone who's come along and bought a ticket. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this, as well as mark a year of the OCD Chronicles, was that I wanted to raise some money for London OCD, which is the support group that I genuinely believe saved my life, alongside my mum and my wife. We've raised £500 for them tonight, which I think is fantastic. So thank you to everyone for donating and buying a ticket. I think that's all we've got, but thank you very much, and solidarity to all.
Thanks, James.
See you guys.
Cheers.